right, friends, this is the continuation of the video that I made about Venus and Pisces, and especially its transits this year in 2025, which will go until about April. This is part 2 now. We're going to focus on the life lessons that this transit is going to bring. And it's worth remembering that this cycle of Venus, even though we keep talking about Venus and Pisces, it's actually starting in Aries, and then from Aries is retrograding back into Pisces. It's going to go over a bunch of difficult planets. It's going to go back into Aries, and on it goes with the rest of its movement. So in this video, we will discuss the life lessons. But before getting there, please remember to like, subscribe, and comment, especially your comments with your life experiences. It will help me and everyone else, as I said in the last video, to learn as case studies. We need to engage with the symbolism in a real manner that expresses itself in a real life experiences. So it's super important. I will be eternally grateful to you, and I look forward to seeing how you guys are experiencing this. Without further ado, let us begin. So as I was saying, this transit is not any old transit of Venus through Pisces. But Venus is going to go through a lot by the time it's done with this entire cycle. It's going to be a very profound period of introspection and transformation when it comes to redefining what love and connection means in our lives. And because it's going to move through the sign of Aries, we also have to redefine what our sense of individuality means while we're trying to merge and connect with other people or other facet of our lives. And as I just said, this transit is going to go far beyond the simplistic delineation of Venus and Pisces, which is about unconditional love and selfless love. It's going to become a theme of what it means to unify, to have unity, and still to have a sense of separateness and distinctness. So we're kind of talking about polarities, but not really. We're talking about a spectrum. It's just a different side of the coin, and we're trying to figure out through this transit how to bring these concepts together and even merge these concepts. So in a sense, this dichotomy is between unity and separateness, surrender and self-assertion, being boundless, and at the same time having boundaries and differentiation between things. So in this transit, Venus is becoming our guru. Shukra in the Vedic tradition is considered a guru, a teacher, just like Jupiter. They're both always imparting a particular kind of a knowledge. And Venus's lessons, as I said, is not going to be easy because Venus is going to meet Saturn. It's going to hit North Node Rahu, planet of delusions and illusions, Neptune. It's going to encounter a retrograde and a debilitated Mercury. So there's a lot happening here in this transit. And there's enormous amount of life lessons that are going to unfold. So just to briefly go over these life lessons. So I'm going to get more into the nitty-gritties of it as Venus hits these points as we move along this transit. As discussed in the last video, Venus is about pure merging with the other. It's the desire to dissolve all boundaries and all differentiations and all limits. As the lover, it wants to become one with the beloved. It wants to dissolve the spaces that exist between things in order to become a unified whole. Like in the last video, I was explaining so much so that Venus in Pisces is not going to see other people's flaws and imperfections. It sees others as itself. Itself is the other. So it has this willingness to merge and to unite with others. But we got to take into consideration where this Venus in Pisces is going to end up and how it's going to retrograde, which is in the sign of Aries. And we got to remember the sign of Aries, which is ruled by Mars. Both Aries and Mars are saying something about our sense of individuality, our difference between, like my difference in relation to who you are and what you're about. The sign of Aries is denoting something about individuation, that spark of life, that potentiality that gets an expression in this world as itself, which is different than everything else. And the sign of Aries is about self-assertion. There's boldness here. It's about fearless action, for example. And this shift from Pisces, where it wants to merge and to be one, and it doesn't want to have differentiations, and it wants to cooperate, compassion, empathy. Suddenly, Venus has moved into the sign of Aries, and now it's negotiating with this kind of an energy. And this will be fine if it was just moving forward. But this Venus has to go backwards with the sense that is getting in the sign of Aries. It's going to have to take this back into the sign of Pisces. And this brings up the challenge for this Venus retrograde cycle, which is going to ask us, how are you going to retain your individual identity while participating in the act of merging with other people? Like in the sign of Pisces, we're drawn to lose ourselves to love, in love. But as soon as Venus moves back into Aries, or moves into Aries for the first time, Venus's attention is called back to itself. So we're called back to ourselves again in the sign of Aries. And Aries demands differentiation. It wants to remind us how we are a distinct and a different individual, and how we're separated from those people that we love, as well as the circumstances that we find ourselves in. Whereas Venus and Pisces just wants to see everything connected. So the lesson here is about finding a balance. When I was talking about that different sides of the same coin, that spectrum that's going to represent itself as a polarity and a dichotomy here, a paradox almost, which is about maintaining our individuality, our unique sense of individual self, while at the same time, we're deeply engaged with other people. So in this sense, this transit might show us, where do we overextend ourselves? How do we lose healthy boundaries, for example? Where do we violate other people's boundaries? And how do we establish a healthy sense of separateness to, for example, avoid the traps of codependency in this dynamic? Or let's say over-identification with someone else's needs, or how we idealize them. So all of these contradictions between these signs are going to play themselves out as a kind of a conundrum that we're going to have to grapple with within our own personal experiences with ourselves and the environments that we engage in. Another lesson that this transit's going to bring forth is about boldness versus surrender, in a sense that we're going to have to do a dance between receptivity and assertiveness. For example, when Venus is in Aries, Aries brings out the warrior quality of Venus. And for those of you who are familiar with the Vedic tradition, Shukra, which is Venus, also has a side where he is a warrior. And when Venus in general, when it comes into the sign of Aries, it wants to be bold. It wants to express love boldly. It wants to conquer. It wants to initiate. And it wants to pursue passion without fear. However, this boldness can turn into selfishness or dominance, for example. It can easily overshadow other people's needs, or all the kinds of subtlety that true and real sustainable connections require. That receptivity that Venus generally has, that creates that room and that space for someone else to enter, and the sign of Aries, because of that initiating, outmoving force that suddenly it gets possessed by, it might not be able to do this, which is actually very necessary for healthy relationships. So in this sense, one of the lessons of Venus in Aries, when it's ingressed after Pisces, is how do we balance boldness with surrender? This back and forth between Aries and Pisces is very much asking us that question. For example, in Aries, we're very much propelled to make our desires known, what it is I want. How do I want things done? What do I want you to do for me, for example? It makes these kinds of bold statements to the lover, for example, or it can boldly start pursuing someone else without stopping and pausing to see what it is they need, what it is that they want. So this back and forth motion between Pisces and Aries, it's going to initiate questions such as, how do we honor the desire of other people while we honor our own desires? Is our boldness turning into recklessness, for example? Or have we been authentic to ourselves in the pursuit of love and establishing connection with other people? These are the kinds of questions that are going to rise up and the things that we have to wrestle with. Because in the sign of Pisces, we can become like mashed potato and submit where perhaps we shouldn't submit. And then we get into the sign of Aries, and there's this overpowering kind of a self-assertiveness that can turn into self-assertion. You're just trying to assert yourself into someone else's life because that's what you desire. That's what you want. So we got to find the middle ground between all of these notions of connecting with others, but having a healthy sense of self and a sense of individuality at the same time. So in a sense, this Venus cycle is going to show us when to take action and when to surrender, when to step forward boldly, and then when to be receptive, open, and vulnerable. In a sense, the lesson of Venus in this cycle is a lesson of humility. We have to learn that assertiveness without compassion will most definitely lead to some kind of an imbalance, and that true strength often comes from that power of discernment to know what time it is, when it's time for what, when we should yield and when we should proceed. And that's debilitated Mercury. That Mercury that's going to go through Pisces is going to retrograde from Aries and move back with Venus in its debilitated form, is talking about how we will be grappling, how these are topics that we'll be grappling with. Something that I'll discuss further as I was saying, these conjunctions come to closer degrees and we'll start talking about those. But just right now, just setting the grounds for what to expect or what kind of themes might come up. And because there's a retrograde involved here with Venus, we might very well be revisiting old wounds. And the purpose of that is to heal that shadow side of love that exists within us, how we have projected ourselves in the past or how others have projected themselves onto us and the ways that we've behaved. And then we're finding ourselves behaving that way again. So this is actually a time also for reflection, to understand these kinds of dynamics that exist within us that are constantly being recreated in our relationships. For example, specifically when Venus goes into Aries, those ways that we are not balanced in relationship dynamics can come to the forefront, especially since Venus was already in Pisces and it was conjuncting some difficult planets. Now in the sign of Aries, when it gets a sense of itself, these things can be illuminated. And one thing that will happen in Venus, when it moves out of Pisces into Aries, in its retrograde period back, it's going to form a conjunction with the sun, and it's a Kazimi. So there's suddenly this realization that we're supposed to have. It's going to unfold within the mind when this Kazimi point happens. For example, where we've been unbalanced can be where there were power dynamics in relationships, where we were overpowering or we were over submitting to someone else, and we felt disempowered. In a sense, this retrograde period is showing us how to let go of old hurts and release unhealthy attachments that we've had in the past, and we're carrying it forward into the future. It's showing us how this process of wanting to merge with other people have caused us pain in the past. For example, the ways that we lost ourselves into other people. So the challenge here is to confront that shadow aspect of love, or the ways that we love. For example, this Venus cycle is going to ask us, how do we hold on to unhealthy ideals and illusions of love, or our significant other, or situations that we want to connect with? Where do we tend to romanticize a certain situation or our partner, which is essentially a way of avoiding the discomfort of dealing with the reality of who and what another person is, what a circumstance actually is. It is also not wanting to take the burden and the responsibility of acting assertively sometimes. So we put all the burden on our partner, on another individual, or on the situation that we're in, by creating these illusions of how things ought to be. So without responsibility, we disengage from it. For example, a lot of people, when they end a relationship with someone else, they'll express at the end that this is my ideal version of a relationship. You don't give me that. So this is a problem, right? Because usually in this kind of a dynamic, the person will find themselves in another relationship doing the exact same thing. So at some point, we have to take responsibility for these ways that we conceptualize things, and then hold, let's say, other people responsible to them or project certain things to them. We need to become aware. This transit of Venus is calling for awareness and consciousness towards how we connect with other people in different situations in life. So in a lot of ways, This retrograde cycle of Venus wants to show us our vulnerabilities, our illusions, where we blur the lines between fantasy and reality, for example. And especially because Venus will conjunct Saturn 3 times, is trying to give us a greater sense of maturity about what it means to love, what it means to connect with different facets of life. In a sense, this transit is going to show us something about self-value, self-worth, and self-respect, but at the same time, respecting and honoring people that we are in a relationship with, situations that we want to connect with. This becomes a very prominent theme in this retrograde cycle. And if you refer back to the last video, I talk a lot about differentiation and the process of merging and unification. And this entire retrograde is kind of talking about this theme over and over, to be exact, 3 times, because Venus is going to go forward, Venus is going to go backwards, and then Venus is going to go forward again. So it's about integration of differentiation. It's about how do we go from that oneness that is demanded in Pisces to also being self-possessed and an individual as Venus moves into Aries, and then back and then forth. So this back and forth is going to be an invitation to understand the spectrum, which is the unity of Pisces and the individuality of Aries. In a sense, this transit is teaching us how do we love, which requires that merging and that unification without losing ourselves. And at the same time, how do we maintain our identity without building these big separating walls that shut other people out, especially people that we want to be in a relationship with? So we're going to learn the paradoxical lessons of love and unity through this Venus retrograde cycle. It's about being both soft and strong, to merge but not to lose ourselves, how to shine individually but not losing our connectivity to the greater whole, for example. So it's a journey of integration, and it's a journey that's going to refine our approach to love. It's going to show us how we can heal from our past experiences, our past mistakes, and to embody a kind of a love that's dignified, that understands the dignity of the self and understands the dignity of others. And it understands that love in itself is a state that is dignified. This is a very important thing. We use other people a lot of times in relationship. Even though we think that we love them, we're trying to fulfill some, for example, an inner void, an inner need. And we make these crazy demands on other people, for example, to do this. Or there's that sense of codependency where it's also using another person, because where we need to be assertive, we have just so merged with another person and now expect them to do those things for us, which also creates a sense of burden in another person. So it's trying to show us how to integrate this notion of the individual and the collective or the other, where they both have their own integrity, where one is not being sacrificed for the other, being destroyed for the other. So this is one of the lessons that is very much going to come to the forefront. Yeah, I would say in general, this is a transit about showing us how to honor the self and how to honor the other. I mean, the ultimate lesson, as I said, for Venus in Pisces, for example, is to not have this differentiation. But here we are in the human realm, negotiating to the best of our abilities. And these are some ways to that ultimate potential that exists for Venus and Pisces. And to continue here, just to finish off this video, very briefly, I'm going to hit on every conjunction of Venus with different planets, just to set the stage, because the upcoming videos are going to get very specific. So the full length of one of the videos will be Venus conjunct Saturn. And what does that mean in Pisces? What does that mean when it's going through its retrograde motion? And hitting it for the second time and then the third time. So I'm just going to give an overview right now, but I'm going to take a little break first and come right back to it. All right, I'm back. So we're going to start with the first planet that Venus is going to meet, and it will be Saturn. Da, 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 da. All right. So, of course, Saturn, as usual, has to teach us the lessons of boundaries and our limitations, because Saturn's always Saturn, and Saturn's always going to do what Saturn does. So, this connection is going to have a very sobering effect on Venus and Pisces. Saturn, as a lord of structures and limitations in the expansive, vast ocean of Pisces, like a dam just sitting there as a cosmic dam in the cosmic ocean, will ask Venus to evaluate how it perceives love, how it perceives this merging, this need to merge, this need to unify with others. It's going to ask it a question and to create feelings that will challenge this. It's going to ask Venus and Pisces, what kind of structures do you have in this relationship to uphold this relationship? What do you need to do realistically not to have this relationship break apart or these connections to this situation that you have? What's necessary to keep it all together and to have a sense of realism about it? So the life lesson here is about finding boundaries, is to understand the limitations of ourselves and the relationship that we're in, or that life circumstance that we're in. It's about committing to reality and learning how to make certain things work in increments that are realistic and pragmatic. Saturn's going to show us how we come to put conditions on love and how other people put conditions on love, which are essentially the limitations. So we're going to have to grapple with this. So a lot of illusions and delusions that we might have about love, about our partners, Saturn's going to bring them to the forefront and it's going to challenge them. Saturn's going to, for instance, show us a romantic or romanticized notion of love, our partners, life circumstances that we're connected to. And it's going to show us how they actually lack foundation and we're just dealing pretty much in the fantasy land instead of what is real. Another thing that Saturn can do here is to show us how we have built walls around our heart to protect it, or Saturn's actually going to demand in certain situations for us to build some walls around our hearts to not become so intermingled and dissolved into another human being. And this is very painful to do for Venus and Pisces. Venus and Pisces doesn't want to do that. Venus and Pisces wants to unify, become whole, merge. And Saturn's saying, no, this is not a place where you dissolve. It's putting its mark of limit on something here. And this is painful for Venus and Pisces. So our experience is not going to be pleasant with this reality reveal of Saturn and what it's going to demand of us. But essentially, what Saturn's trying to teach us here is, again, how to negotiate with that paradox that we're going to be dealing with through this Saturn retrograde period. And that initial contact of Venus with Saturn is revelation of reality, what the reality of things really are, not how you want it to be, not how you are demanding of your partner to be, but how things really are, how your partner really is, how you yourself are like in a relationship context. And Saturn ultimately wants us to have the proper structures here to support reality and not our fantasies. And this is a hard pill to swallow when Venus comes into conjunction with Saturn in the sign. Next, as soon as a cup of the reality mojo that it got from Saturn feeling all bummed out, it's almost as if it becomes a little delusional again when it meets Rahu North Node. Again, it wants to expand its desires and its fantasies. This happens often in life. This is it's not enough to know something. Like if I tell you something, it's not enough, for example, for you to go and take that information and change your life. That information has to get incorporated to what you already know. It needs to settle in you and become a part of your being, which we call wisdom. And in that instance, then we are able to act and to do different. So in a sense, Saturn in that first round is just acting like a messenger. like I'm showing it to you. I'm showing what the reality of all these things are. But because we've been conditioned otherwise, as soon as Venus hits Rahu, it's like it's back to La La Land. Is what you just read, but not retained. The information that was just given, the reality that was just shown, is just gets diffused again because you're back into yourself and how you've been conditioned to think and feel, which you desire in general. And Rahu North Node very much represents our desires and our ambitions, the way that we want to externalize ourselves and project and go out in the world to get what we want to get. Rahu is always amplifying what is out there, what is external to us. And again, our ideals are usually some objects in the world, some person in the world, some way of being in the world. So Rahu's going to amplify these ideals, even though it just got the sobering truth from Saturn. And the delusion of Rahu, which is like a magnifying glass that exponentially enlarges everything to infinity, is that we feel almost limitless where Rahu's sitting. So here with Venus and Pisces, where it's talking about unconditional love, it wants infinite unconditional love, infinite expansive love, infinite merging with another person. And Saturn just showed it. Do you have the foundations for that? Do you know how to do that? Does your partner have the capacity to do that? It forgot. It's almost as if the seed was sown, but it has not grown yet. And when Venus meets Rahu, those desires, those unrealistic expectation, idealization, romanticism that it has, it comes to the forefront again. So the challenge of Venus meeting Rahu is again the challenge of distinguishing real connection from illusional and delusional connection, for lack of a better word here. I mean, Venus in Pisces already struggles with boundaries. Venus in the sign of Pisces. And Rahu here is creating boundless desires that in reality lacks substance. The very question that Saturn was asking about, do you have the infrastructure, the foundation, the structure to, in a real kind of way, to support this? Rahu's again out to lunch, just exponentially making the desire itself super large and amplified. So this lesson that Rahu's bringing us is, how do you navigate your desires? Because sometimes, for example, pain is a good indicator that something's wrong. When something aches a little bit and we can move through it, we're like, whatever. But when it gets really bad, we'll call an ambulance, 911, take me to the hospital now, check it out. I think I'm dying. So by the virtue of the fact that Rahu will amplify things to such a great extent, it's actually doing us a service because Venus is going to go back and forth. Eventually, when Venus makes that last contact with Rahu for the last time, we have complete awareness of where we're acting delusional, where our illusions are, where we are not realistic. So Rahu's given us a lesson about how to navigate our desires. It's showing us where our pursuit is actually inspired by something true and real that has an application in the world, and where they're driven by restlessness or lacks or gaps and our inability to find, let's say, satisfaction. And I discussed this in a video that I did about the nakshatra of Purva Bhadrapada, which is where all of these planets are situated, that Venus is going to constantly hit. So that's another thing you guys can check out. I'll link it to the end of this video, which is all about the satisfaction that's created in this nakshatra, and especially with Saturn there, it intensifies it. Rahu also intensifies it. So this conjunction with Rahu's going to make us realize the underlying motivation behind our connection and how we perceive romantic situations and generally whatever circumstance that we're trying to connect with in life. So yeah, we're gonna see our fantasies and our illusions and our delusions thanks to Rahu North Node being here. And then in that first round, Venus is going to come to a conjunction with Neptune. Like things weren't bad enough, right? And again, we are going to see with Neptune another round our delusions and our illusions about how we connect. But what Neptune is going to show us is a little bit different than Rahu. Rahu was showing us our desires out there, how we're trying to fulfill it out in the world, in the external realm. Neptune will actually exponentially show how we are self-deceiving ourselves. So it's going to show our illusions in ways, for example, that we use the other as escapism, not to see that thing that Saturn was trying to show us, how we escape, how we diffuse the situation suddenly. For example, projection is an act of diffusing your own internal need and then just projecting it onto another person. So Neptune's going to bring this to the forefront. But at the same time, because Neptune diffuses, Neptune is not going to reveal what is real, that sobering perspective that we need that Saturn already showed us. Neptune kind of likes us to be in the fantasy la la land. So again, Neptune here, like Rahu, is going to augment what is not real, for example, so that eventually we get to see it. And eventually we do get to see it because this retrograde cycle is going to hit Neptune 3 times. And I would argue one of the points that Neptune's really going to bring to the forefront is how we use love as a kind of escapism from preventing us from seeing what is real and what actually needs to be done, where we're actually are in our evolution as a human being in comparison to our mental imagery and imagining of what love ought to be. By creating this satisfaction, by bringing this to the forefront, we're starting to get in touch with it. So again, these planets create hardships, but there's a lesson here. There's something that they're trying to teach us if we want to take it that way. So in a sense, Neptune, that underlying question in the subconscious that is trying to bring forth is about, are we actually willing to love fully and unconditionally, selflessly? Or are we just losing ourselves in some sort of a fantasy that actually prevents real grounded connection? So this is another thing that's going to happen while Venus is in Pisces. Then, of course, Venus is going to ingress forward into Aries. And one of the first conjunctions that Venus is going to make in that sign is with Mercury. And the lesson here is about the ways the self is revealed and communicated to the self after all the craziness that Venus just went through in Pisces. And Mercury is a planet of the intellect and communication. So one of its primary roles here is to communicate the message of Aries into Venus that's transiting and coming conjunct with Mercury. For example, this connection is going to make Venus contemplate about, how do I actually and authentically, the way that I desire things, how am I able to actually communicate this with my partner or to others? How do I communicate my needs, for example? How do I communicate how I love someone or how I need to feel loved? So it's getting these kinds of a lesson through this conjunction. It's also getting revelations about how we assert ourselves in relationship through our communication, the kinds of words that we use or the tone that we take with other people. And we'll see it because we're interacting with other people. These kinds of revelation could be in one's mind, just thinking, reflecting, contemplating, and meditating. But it can also come through while engaging with the partner. And we just went through the Pisces. We did all this projection and we're looking at our partner and we're like, I need to merge with God. And your partner's like, but I am human. And the kind of conflict, let's say, is going to create, and the way Venus is going to feel the need to assert itself with Mercury, it might actually blurt things out, where that is, again, an act of revelation for Venus in Aries in terms of how it asserts itself. How does it communicate? And we've got to remember, Venus is going to go back into Pisces. So it's going to take all these lessons that it's getting in Aries to go back into Pisces to refine them before it moves out again. Like, we'll come to see that through this communicative way of Mercury and Aries with Venus here, the kind of revelation that we may get communicating with our partner, we'll come to see, hey man, I got some lessons to learn in terms of how to be assertive and express myself, and at the same time take someone else into consideration. That could become a lesson. It's going to address especially when Venus is connected with Mercury in Aries. When it's retrograding, is going to show us how we miscommunicate. And through this miscommunication, we'll start to understand how we see ourselves and how we see the others and how we're able to connect with them as an individual, one individual person to another individual person. So this could be part of the lesson of Mercury conjunct Venus in Aries. Next, we'll have Venus conjunct the Sun, and Venus is at its Kazimi point, so exact degrees with the Sun in the sign of Aries. And we got to remember here that the Sun is exalted, right? So Venus is at the heart of the Sun, fully illuminated and empowered. So it's full of clarity. That's what the Sun represents: vision, clarity, decisiveness. And we got to remember again, it's an exalted Sun too in this Kazimi. So this is almost as if you have a moment of remembering the higher self, the soul, the consciousness. It's almost like having the self purified after going through all that garbage of illusions, delusions, projections, and Saturn giving you the super uber sobering elixir where that even felt unreal because it was in the sign of Pisces. You get this Kazimi point of Venus with the Sun where you're just like, wait a minute, this is who I am. This can also make you realize who the other person is. You know, sometimes we need to understand who we are to understand where another person's coming from. So in a sense, it's a rebirth of Venus. It's about integrating. I was saying earlier, a lesson can be taught, but if it's not internalized, it's not learned. This Kazimi point is almost like that remembering of everything that Venus just went through in Pisces, and including with the revelations that it got from Mercury. And it's like, all right, I get it. It's internalized. And from this, there's almost like a renewed sense of self. There's a new kind of a self-understanding, self-concept. And the Sun brings purpose, clarity, and a sense of clear direction to Venus here before it dips back into Pisces. Here, with this kind of a revelation that Venus gets from the Sun, Venus is able to ask, how do I shine as an individual, maintain my integrity without jeopardizing my relationships? How can I also do that for other people? There's a greater sense of clarity coming on. It's not just sobriety. It's having a sense of direction too now. And in a sense, the Sun is teaching Venus how to have a healthy relationship, which means that we have to have a healthy, energized sense of self with a lot of vitality. And hopefully this is about understanding the ego, but in a healthy way. The ego in the way that the ego is always trying to connect us to the external world. So I actually very much like this conjunction of Venus with the Sun after all the crap that it just went through and all the crap that is going to go back to. We'll talk about that in another video. We're just talking about just briefly just going through all of this right now, all the conjunctions. And of course, Venus is going to move back into Pisces, hit all those planets in their inverse order now. So now Neptune, Rahu North Node, and then Saturn. So this time is about not just feeling things out, and it's causing a lot of pain, but now this time is about, okay, what have I learned? How do I, for example, discern real love from the illusions that I have in my head, the fantasies that I have? This is a point where Venus might look at its partner and say, have we integrated our desires in this relationship in a good way, where your integrity is maintained and my integrity is maintained? Do our values align? What do we need to do? How can we take certain actions so that we can actually love each other in a healthier way? Here, the lessons that were taught in that first round through just a reactive kind of a way. Sorry, my back got so itchy suddenly. In a reactive kind of a way is becoming embodied when Venus is going back. And by the time Venus stations and goes direct, we're really internalizing those lessons. They're becoming part of our wisdom. We can actually have the proper actions now to be able to enact them. And again, I'll talk about those more as these conjunctions are made along the way. But I do want to talk about one other thing that, of course, had to happen through this Venus retrograde cycle. And that has to do with when Venus enters Pisces, is forming a stellium with Saturn, Rahu, and Neptune, right? But when Venus, just when it's starting to ingress into Aries for that first round, there's another stellium being formulated, formed in the sign of Pisces, which will include the Sun and debilitated Mercury, which also has a profound impact on this Venus cycle. But that's something I'm going to have to talk about later because I feel like I've talked for so long because I'm recording the previous video and this video on the same day, but as two separate videos. So I will come back to that. But just to conclude this video, we could say that this entire journey of Venus in this retrograde cycle is a journey of transformation. One that will require us to understand the truth about ourselves, how we connect with other people, how we perceive love and connection. And at the same time, what does it mean to have a sense of individual self and at the same time to be connecting with other people? And then every conjunction in this cycle is showing us how we can do this, and is getting us deeper and deeper into the lessons that we need to see and learn and internalize, embody, so that we can enact them in a healthy way. In a way, Venus is trying to find love that is boundless and grounded at the same time. The lessons are about boundaries and surrender, desire and discernment, communication and silence, courage and humility. This dealing with tension points, right? These are the lessons that we're supposed to learn through this cycle. And this cycle of Venus with its retrograde, it's going to ask us to navigate the spaces between self and other, to dissolve and merge and again return back to ourselves. And then with a clearer sense of who we are, to go back into that relationship or to that dynamic and understand, can we merge with this person? How to merge with this person? Whatever the lessons that have unfolded, it's going to start to have an application. In a sense, it's kind of a cycle of purification. It's about turning our internal and emotional waters over 1,000,000 times. And we've got to remember the entire time, this series of movements of Venus through Pisces and Aries is either getting a trine or a square from a debilitated Mars that's finishing its own retrograde cycle, right? But the point of it is that we emerge from all of this that we're going to go through so that we can love more deeply, more wholly, and at the same time have a good sense of ourselves. And as a final note, of course, pay attention to which house this is occurring in, because it's going to use those themes of that house, the kinds of people that house signifies, to reveal and to show these lessons. And I'll be back to discuss the transits further in more details, conjunction by conjunction. And if time permits, I'll explain the nakshatras also, but I'll see how I'll do for time. That's it for today. Much love. Till next time.